Okay, sir. So
Yeah, okay, all right.
I think it's now on record. So, sir, first of all, thank you so much for being with us. I think I waited for 6 months for this conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I would like to start from something basic. Why do we need to remember, and like why do we need to talk about, and why do we need to remember Bacha Khan?
Well, I think there are many reasons. Different people will seek to remember him for different reasons. So let me begin with this observation. I think that if you're looking at the 20th century, uh, he is unquestionably one of the most gigantic figures of the 20th century, not just for uh, uh, the people in Pakistan and Afghanistan, for the Pashtuns.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's a gigantic figure for the world and needs
Mm-hmm.
to be far better recognized than he is. There are certain constituencies that recognize him. People who have long studied nonviolence understand his critical place. But even there, I think you will agree with me. Uh, we often hear of the trajectory going from Mohandas Gandhi to Martin Luther King and then to Mandela.
Yeah.
You'll see innumerable number of posters, books, which put the three together. Badshah Khan is not there, although Gandhi himself said that Bacha Khan was the most perfect exponent of satyagraha that he had ever known. Uh,
Wow.
Most perfect exponent of nonviolent resistance. So that's part of the answer to the question why he should be remembered. But in the Muslim world, because we do need to keep in mind that Badshah Khan is also a devout Muslim, and and in the West there has been a persistent and erroneous belief that Islam, of all the religions, is the one that cannot be reconciled with traditions of nonviolence. I think Badshah Khan showed that that is, in fact, a completely erroneous way of thinking. And it's very interesting to think through what is happening, for example, at the present moment in the Middle East, in Palestine, uh, more specifically. And we have to think about why is it that nonviolent resistance is not even mentioned. And in the It's now nearly 2 years since Hamas's attack of October 7th of 2023, and I've heard calls for peace,
Yes.
but I have not heard any call for nonviolence,
Okay.
right? And it's interesting to think why that's the case, but that's a
Yes.
separate subject. Uh, the reason why it's relevant to the question that you're posing is because I think that we need to understand that there are traditions of nonviolence in the world of Islam, as they are in with every religion. And there are, of course, traditions of nonviolence which are not necessarily associated with religion. Uh, but insofar as we're thinking of the possibilities of nonviolent resistance anywhere in the world, we have to think about the most spectacular examples, the most disciplined examples, and what Badshah Khan offered is certainly one of the most disciplined instances of nonviolent resistance in the world, and that too among a people who were not known for that. That's a
Yes.
long history. I'm sure we'll get into that. So
Yes.
that's, I think, the answer to your question.
I think this would be a slight digression from the topic that we have currently, but you mentioned that about like the non-violent resistance is not even mentioned, and this is a very significant point, and I completely agree with it. And when we are discussing here the philosophy of Bacha Khan, there are a lot of people who are questioning this idea of non-violence. So, like, do you think like non-violence is still instrumental or could be instrumentalized successfully for liberation struggle and resistance movement? Like, they could still get us to some goals.
Oh, yes, of course. But I think that we will first have to understand what it is, because nonviolence is not simply the abstention from violence. That's
Mm-hmm.
the fatal mistake. So
Okay.
when you look at protest movements, for example, in the US, I had gone, this last Saturday was what was called the No Kings
Mm-hmm.
protests, which were held
Yes.
throughout the United States. There were over 2,000
Yes.
of them. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
These are protests which were held uh, as a form of demonstration against what the Trump regime uh, is doing, the absolutely inhumane, reckless way in which they are, for example, deporting people,
Yes.
including those who have a legal right to be in the U.S.,
Yes.
breaking up families, uh, and so on and so forth. We don't need to get into all the details. Now, were
Yes.
those 2000 demonstrations not violent? The people who took part in it will say they were. I will say not necessarily, simply
Mm-hmm.
because if they're not using violence, that doesn't mean that they're not violent. Badshah Khan understood the difference between the two. There's a difference between saying that they were peaceful, that is,
Mm-hmm.
that the protesters didn't use violence, but nonviolence, according to its advocates, is almost like a science. It's a process. That would be the better word to use.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process. So,
Okay.
nonviolence is not simply the abstention from violence, it's a way of living in the world. And the person who so the word that you use, instrumentalized, Badshah Khan and Gandhi would both have some difficulty with using that word. They would not use it. I know the spirit in which you used it,
Yes.
so therefore I wouldn't object to the question, but they would never use that word, because then nonviolence becomes a means, okay,
Yes.
to some other end. And that is not how they thought of nonviolence. Nonviolence is its own end, so to speak. That is that
Okay.
if you dedicate yourself to a certain objective, uh, th- but think only of the means that you have to use. The means have to be consistent, ethically consistent with the principles of nonviolence. Then the outcome will invariably be good. That is
Mm-hmm.
the supposition on which both Bacha Khan and Gandhi and other advocates of nonviolence have worked. I have to also say, in the spirit in which you asked the question, that in my view, nonviolence has not been really carried out, tested, practiced, understood in Palestine. It has not been.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Well, I think this is a very radical point, and yes, I did use the word instrumentalized, and I was listening to you. You were saying that for Gandhi and for Bacha Khan, non-violence was like a way of being in the world. So yeah, they were not just looking at it from the standpoint of like this instrumentalization. I am curious about like what were the influences that made Bacha Khan, like about the person that we are currently speaking. What made that person? Like the intellectual influences, the sort of situation he was living in that made him Bacha Khan.
Okay. So your question is really what went into the making of Badshah Khan.
Yes,
Okay. And I think
yes,
that that includes more than, the history of the frontier,
mm-hmm.
the history of incidents in his life. It's the totality of who he was and the environment he came from, and the kind of family he grew up in, and the place of Islam. So it to do a to put forward a very systematic answer would take some period of time. So we can summarize
Yes,
it in the
yes,
following way. The first is that he is a man who is devout. He is a man who comes from a religious background, and he thought of Islam. The word really means submission, as you know, right? So submission to Allah in this case, but that is to the divine, whatever religion you belong to. Okay. Um So the first thing that goes into the making of Bacha Khan is certainly the fact that he thinks of himself and tries to act as um, a ethical Muslim, not just devout, but as an ethical Muslim. Okay, that's the first thing. Uh, I want to underscore that because once again, I want to go back to what I had said just a few minutes earlier, that especially in the West and even in countries such as India now, there is a widespread feeling that Islam cannot be reconciled with traditions of nonviolent resistance, that there is something inherently violent in the religion, etc. That feeling is a feeling that has been there in the West, and over the last several decades, particularly, I would say in the since in the U.S. at least, uh, particularly after the September 11th bombings of 2001, but even before that, when the U.S. was already, at war with Iraq and was also watching the now forgotten war between Iraq and Iran, which took place
Yes.
over a period of 8 years, the general feeling was that uh, Islam is too closely intertwined with various traditions of violence, right? And so I think that Badshah Khan is someone who comes out of a tradition which tries to establish something different. Secondly, what went into the making of Badshah Khan was uh, what we might describe as the whole history and traditions of the frontier. Okay,
Mhm.
that is a Northwest Frontier Province, as it was known in his time, or part of his time. He was born uh, actually before the Northwest Frontier Province was born, because people are unaware of the fact that, of course, that area was there, but it was not called the Northwest Frontier Province. That
Mhm.
Lord Curzon, who was a viceroy, created that in the very early 1900s. Now, what I'm going to say here may appear to contradict what I had said earlier, but not really. The frontier has, or the Northwest Frontier Province had, and in short, we'll call it just the frontier, had a number of traditions which we need to be alert to. So, one is a tradition uh, that was associated with, in fact, violence. Okay, so in colonial writings, it had long the Pathan as or the Pashtun had long been represented as a very hot-headed person. Okay,
Yeah.
and the Pashtun was said to live under the code of revenge, colloquially badla. Okay, live under that code. That if the person had been wronged, he was sworn to take revenge, and hostilities between the families might continue for generations. That was at least the tradition of the frontier, certainly according to all the
Mhm.
colonial writers, unquestionably. And Bacha Khan himself, by the way, in a number of places says that he has encountered that. Okay, I mean,
Yes.
so the Pashtuns are not necessarily denying that. But there was another tradition there, which was also equally important, and that was the tradition of hospitality. Okay,
Yes.
if
Absolutely.
someone comes to your door and seeks hospitality, and if it happens to be your enemy, you still have to give them hospitality. Okay,
Yes.
the tradition of hospitality. Now, this tradition of hospitality is very interesting because, and this is where we have to do some real philosophical interpretive work, okay, which I'm going to do very briefly, which is
Mhm.
that the tradition of hospitality has an intrinsic relationship to nonviolence. It explains in part why later on, Badshah Khan, much to the amazement of everyone in the world who understood what he was doing there, was able to organize these Pashtuns who were renowned, okay, fighters, who were known to carry a gun with them, so to speak, all the time. how he was able to organize them into an organization known as a Khudai Khidmatkars,
Girls.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
which was the largest uh, organized army of nonviolent resistors in the world.
Organized army of non-violence.
Yeah, yeah. You think of,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, what an amazing idea it is. But that's what it is.
Yeah.
You see the photographs of the Khudai Khidmatkars
Yes.
marching in formation and acting with the discipline of an army. Okay, but before we get to that, let's go back to what I had said,
Mm.
that there is an intrinsic relationship between hospitality and
And one
the
non-violence.
idea of nonviolence.
Mm.
Because what does nonviolence ask you to do? It asks you to host the otherness of the other within yourself. Okay, let me explain. So
Mm-hmm.
you encounter someone whose ideas are radically different from you, someone who believes in violence. However, the Gandhian idea of nonviolence, an idea that Bacha Khan also had, okay, uh, that idea is that no matter how radical the difference between two people, okay, or two communities, there is always something in common that we have to seek.
Wow.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay? That because that is the basis for the beginning of a dialogue. Okay, and no one is actually monstrous. No one.
Mm-hmm.
Adolf Hitler is not monstrous. His acts may be monstrous, but a person
Yeah.
is never monstrous. Because
Mm-hmm.
when a person commits monstrous acts, in some ways they are deluded. They have been led astray. And the idea of nonviolence, the ontological aspect of nonviolence is that there is a spark of divinity in every single human being in the world. We have to
Okay.
find that spark and lit it. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
idea of hospitality is linked to this, because that is why if your enemy came to your door, okay, seeking your hospitality, the code of Pakhtunwali of and hospitality required that you actually be hospitable to that person. Okay, right? Now, this is important because what is it that you are doing? Hospitality. You are actually hosting that person, okay? That person's difference within yourself,
Wow.
okay? And
Mm-hmm.
this is why, if you ask me, the idea of nonviolence was something that Bacha Khan could cultivate among his fellow Pashtuns, because he knew there was let me put it in a different way now, okay, because sometimes Gandhi and Badshah Khan had this conversation, and Gandhi said to Badshah Khan, it is not surprising that your people have become the most spectacular example of nonviolent resistance, disciplined resistance in the world. And Bacha Khan said, what do you think is the explanation? And Gandhi said, nonviolence is not for the cowards. It's not
Okay.
for there is he makes a distinction between nonviolence of the weak and nonviolence of the strong. Gandhi's view was that most people in India had followed nonviolence, not because they were intrinsically nonviolent or because they even understood it, but because it was the easiest thing to do. Okay? It was the easiest thing to do. For the Pathan to embrace nonviolence required a radical act of belief and conviction and courage, because the Pathan was much more likely to pick up the gun or pick up the sword. Okay? And so it was a much greater test for the Pashtuns, because his view here is that it is only those who are strong who are capable of some kind of disciplined nonviolence. All right.
Non-violence.
And I haven't forgotten the question that you
Yeah.
started with here, which is that what
Yeah.
is what are the things that went into the making of
Bacha Khan.
Bacha Khan? So I
Yeah.
said, okay, Islam, number
Islam,
one. And then I said, let's try to understand the nature of the Pashtun. Okay. And then now,
traditions.
thirdly, we have to think about the history of the frontier because the frontier
Yes.
was a place. So, they made a distinction between the British, between the more settled parts and the non-settled parts, the wilder parts, as it were. But basically, there is no question. The record on this is very clear that the colonial administration brutalized the entire area. They treated the entire frontier as an area that was not civilized, that was savage, and all of that. And I think Badshah Khan was determined to show that, in fact, this area could generate some of the most, and that his people could generate some of the most productive, ethically productive, okay, ideas in the world, right? So this is important, the history of the frontier, because Bacha Khan is going to be a living demonstration of how the colonial idea of the frontier uh, needs to be repudiated. Okay, and when I say that the colonial administration brutalized it, I mean precisely this: that they governed it with an iron hand, and it also meant that they were constantly involved in a tussle between the Pashtuns and all the other people living there and the colonial regime. Okay, and then of course we also have to think fourthly about the example of his own family. So he was certainly inspired by his father, by his grandfather. If I recall correctly, his grandfather actually had been an important player in the middle 19th century, and was punished by the colonial regime, if I remember correctly. But I think that the important thing is that, and his older brother was also a very important person, and continued to be a very important person in the history
Yes.
of the front of that region, of the people, Dr. Khan Sahib, and
Yes.
of course the education. So one of the things that Badshah Khan did get was he got an education which very few people got in that part of the world. Very, very few, but he did. Now, I think his education was not the education of Mohandas Gandhi.
Yeah.
It was much less than that, but it was far more than what a child would receive, because most children were not receiving any education at all in that part of the country. Right? Now, so those are some of the things that went into the making of him. And then, of course, if you move into his teens and so on, he saw the various ways in which colonial officials acted, um, and all of that troubled him immensely. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So I should say when you were speaking about hospitality, I felt that even though we are Pakhtun, I am hearing this interpretation of the idea of hospitality for the first time. And I can now make sense of the fact that in this brutalized region, in the people who were like associated with violence, he could ignite that spirit of non-violence because he could feel that there are like certain seeds of this non-violence within our tradition, which you mentioned hospitality. And um, and and I felt sad as well because after the war on terror, this idea of hospitality was very much weaponized. So for example, if a person would ask why there is this militancy in what we call tribal regions, some would say, okay, the Pakhtuns are very hospitable people. So when a militant comes to their home,
yeah.
they are just like allowing them a space within their home because they are very hospitable. So like we have instrumentalized, again, I was use this word very
The word,
negatively.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
like, and I just like for the first time felt how beautiful this idea is. Like you can argue for respect of diversity based on this idea of hospitality. And from this, as you had said, like this idea of non-violence had emerged. And you were speaking about Bacha Khan when in a lecture. I think one of the thing that I admire in Bacha Khan, because he emerged from this sort of situation, from the area which was, as you said, brutalized. He was not as educated as you said, but still he became the person we are speaking about right now. And one of the thing that I want you to tell us a bit about, you were speaking about the influence, or perhaps the influences of like these traditions of Buddhism and Hinduism that had existed in this region. So, like, is it possible
It's
that they?
possible, yes, it's possible, but I think I mean, yes, I mean, look, there's no question. I mean, we know what happened in the to the Bamiyan Buddhas, as they're called, right?
Mhm,
So Buddhism was obviously before the coming of Islam. It is This area is largely under Buddhist influence, and
mhm,
of course there was to some extent some spread of Hinduism. I would say Buddhism was probably more important, but certainly actually in the area close to Peshawar in the Charshada, right? I think is that the correct
mhm.
pronunciation?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So in that area, there is a tangible influence, very, very tangible influence of Hinduism as well and Buddhism. And in his autobiography, this book here, there are actually several translations into English, but this one is
Yeah,
the one published a few years ago, the most recent translation published by Rowley Books. Bacha Khan actually mentions that, mentions the presence of Buddhism and Hinduism in that area and the tangible ways in which it was experienced. And I think that that may have played a part in creating a certain kind of ambiance. I don't think that you would
mhm,
certainly there were communities. One of the things that he underscores constantly, of course, he's talking about a later time, but he's underscoring the fact that it was uh, the Buddhists and the Sikhs, because there were still small communities of these. Okay, in the
mhm.
20th century, there were still small
Yeah,
communities of these in that area. He said that the Khudai Khidmatkars were trained to protect them. And so
wow.
when the violence would be unleashed on account of Muslim League activity, because as you know, the Muslim League was had a position of extreme hostility towards the KK, towards the Khudai Khidmatkars, that Badshah Khan tells us in his autobiography that the Khudai Khidmatkars were responsible for ensuring the safety of the Buddhists and the Sikhs. Now, I think it was not only because he believed, of course, that they were entitled to their religious practice just like Muslims were, and in that sense, it was his Islam that made him very secular, if you see what I mean. That is, that the tolerance that
Mhm,
he extended to all other faiths came out of his Islam, just like the tolerance that Gandhi extended to all other religions came out of his Hinduism. Okay, same thing with
Hinduism.
Maulana Azad in India, that he was tolerant. He had a extraordinary tolerance for every other religion. He was hospitable to every other religion, not because he was secular and
Yes.
non-religious, but because he was a believer. The
Yeah.
only genuine
Yeah.
secularism comes from the believer, which again seems very
Wow.
ironical and paradoxical to most people. But this was a view that all of these people held. Maulana Azad, Gandhi, Badshah Khan, many others. But here, again, I'm going around in a slightly longer detour here, because going back to the point that you raised, you were asking, really inquiring about the fact that uh, could the Buddhism and that you found in this area, could it have had, and maybe Hinduism, could it have had something to do with the making of somebody like Badshah Khan? And the answer would be yes, but not in a very tangible way. It's
Mhm.
more that it created a certain kind of climate of opinion within him. You
Yeah.
see, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a very like when you were saying that it was their Islam which made them secular, and then you said that for a lot of people, this idea is very paradoxical. I think for those people, it is paradoxical who are educated and who have internalized this idea of Western education so much that they cannot then like they cannot even then feel that it's possible for a person to be secular even if this is if that person is religious. And I was listening to Amal Wali Khan, the grand grandson of Bacha Khan, and he was saying in a podcast that Islam is a very secular religion. So that is like I think the legacy that he is
Yeah.
believing in. Now I would like you to come to this to the question of social reforms, but like the sort of social reforms that he initiated and how that reform impacted Pakhtun society. But if you could comment briefly on this idea that a lot of people think that Abdul Ghaffar Khan is just like an appendage to Gandhi. So like if like the feeling that emerges, if there was no Gandhi, there would not be
Yeah.
Bacha Khan, the person that we remember
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
So how you take all
Okay,
this?
so there are two questions. Um,
Yeah.
One has to do with the traditions of social reform um, that he initiated, and that Badshah Khan or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan uh, or Frontier Gandhi, and that's the second
Yeah.
question. That
Yeah.
that what do we make of this term, the Frontier Gandhi, and the idea, which you're quite right, uh, the idea that there is still a tendency, which goes back to his times, to view Bacha Khan simply as an appendage of
Mhm.
Gandhi. So let's begin with the term Frontier Gandhi. Let me also say very clearly uh, that Bacha Khan himself is very clear that he doesn't like to be addressed as the frontier
Mhm.
Gandhi, and doesn't think of himself, in those terms. There is a very nice biography of Badshah Khan, the most readable biography written in English by Eknath Eswaran. I have actually multiple editions of it. This is the book right here for people who might listen to
Mhm.
this later
Mhm.
on. A Man to Match His Mountains. It does Badshah Khan in real justice, and also takes up this question that you had asked about the frontier Gandhi. So Badshah, let's begin with Badshah Khan's own view on this. He said that there's only one Gandhi. That I'm not fit, but that was his modesty actually. I'm not fit to step into the shoes of Gandhi, and that was his sort of short view of it. The longer, more complex view um, is that he became known, of course, as kind of as the frontier Gandhi, because he was carrying out the ideas of nonviolent resistance that Gandhi had initiated, and offering satyagraha in particular uh, uh, in the frontier. And we've already talked a little bit about the reputation of the frontier. So the idea of the
Yeah.
frontier Gandhi actually is is not necessarily only an idea that he's an appendage to Gandhi. I think some people took it that way. The idea was to
Okay.
place, when
Yeah.
you place Gandhi and frontier together, it's a clash already, you see. That is that the idea of the frontier is not hospitable
Okay.
to Gandhi to begin with. So the frontier Gandhi should not be rejected that easily, simply because what it does is it creates
Yes.
a dramatic effect. It creates a dramatic
Yes.
effect because it suggests that, yeah, there can actually be a very rich tradition of nonviolence in the frontier. Okay. All right. The
Yes.
place where you least expect it. However, the problem with the term is
Yeah.
precisely what you have pointed to, which is that it was taken to mean that Badshah Khan had no ideas of his own, really. That all he was simply doing was following Gandhi's ideas
Mhm.
and precepts and putting them into practice, okay, in the frontier. Now, that idea, I think, has to be rejected. Uh, there's actually a fair bit of
Yes.
work done in recent years, which has helped us to understand how Badshah Khan charted his own path in many ways. Okay, and in many ways, either extended Gandhi's ideas or worked on a parallel trajectory. Okay, right? So the first thing we have to understand, for example,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
don't
Okay.
see this with Gandhi. Gandhi had an idea of education. He called it Nai Talim. Nai Talim. You know the word Talim, of course. So basic education was what he had an idea, but Badshah Khan actually set up a whole bunch of schools, the Azad schools, okay, the freedom schools.
Yes.
There is a
Yes.
book another book I
Yes.
have, which is a book called Bacha Khan's Vision of Alternative Education.
Education.
It's
Yeah.
very badly written. I mean, there are like 1,000 printing errors in the book, but it gives you a list of over 100 schools that were set up by Bacha Khan and his followers. Okay, over 100
Yes.
schools. Many of them were immediately shut down by the colonial regime.
Yeah.
So this also indicates that the obstacles that Badshah Khan had to face were in some ways much greater than the obstacles that Gandhi had to face, you see, okay, in India. This is not properly appreciated and understood often. And the reason why, of course, the Badshah Khan had to face these obstacles was because the colonial view, let's understand it very clearly, the colonial view was, these Pashtuns, they are simple people. They're basically like children. They don't really need education. If they get education, they get corrupted because they get corrupted by the
Oh.
ideas of the elites in the urban areas. Okay. And they don't need any of that, right? This was the colonial view. So when
Oh.
schools were opened in the frontier, they were put down ruthlessly because the colonial view was these schools are contaminating these children. They're feeding them ideas that they don't need. These ideas are of no good in the frontier whatsoever. Life here is simple, let it remain that way. Right? This is fundamentally what the colonial view was. I'm simplifying it, but that's the basics of it, you see. Okay. Now, so when we use the term frontier, and you'll see how I brought in both your questions together now. Okay,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
when we use the term frontier, Gandhi, uh, uh, as you suggest, it points to the fact that Badshah Khan is simply being viewed as somebody who was an appendage, somebody of Gandhi,
Yeah.
somebody who was merely following meekly in his footsteps. No, I don't think that that's the case at all. Because what I'm suggesting is that he set out on his own path. And if we had to think about what are the major contributions to social reform, so I'll just
Yeah.
list your four. Okay. And here again we'll see that the task before him in some ways was greater than the task that Gandhi had set for himself. Although, of course, one had similar kinds of problems in India as well.
Yeah.
It's just that they were in a far more aggravated form to be found in the frontier. And then you had, of course, colonial opposition. Okay. And it took him a long time to find the kind of support he needed to be able to carry out the work that he did, Bacha Khan. So what are the contributions very briefly? The first is his work with the agricultural classes and workers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because what he sought to do was to actually give them a sense of dignity. He also sought to initiate certain kinds of land reforms so that these people would be able to actually farm the land. Because the problem in the frontier was highly inequitable land distribution. So you had some landowners, and then you had very few people who actually, and of course, there are areas that you can't really farm anyhow, but I'm talking about the areas that you could farm. Uh, Basically, and when I say agriculture here, I don't mean only just agriculture in terms of wheat and rice. I'm talking about orchards. That's agricultural
Yeah.
work. Okay, and the valleys there are full of orchards of fruits and so on. All right. So I think his work among the agricultural classes is important. Secondly, the schools, which I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, beginning with the school that he sets up in is in his own hometown, uh, and in the Charshada district more broadly, and then fanning out into other parts where the Pashtuns were dominant. This book that I was pointing to, Bacha Khan's Vision of Alternative Education, lists all the schools actually. Okay, and it's a long list of schools and where they were located. But the astonishing
Yeah.
thing, as I said, is that most of these schools actually really didn't last very long. Part of the reason they didn't last very long is because they were actually forcibly shut down. Some of them had, so, for example, if you look at these pages over here, this is just a table.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
it is it's just a table of all the schools, the Azad Islamia Madrasa, Turangzai, Akbarpura, Zaida, okay, etc., etc. Right? So schooling,
Yeah.
that was, and schooling of girls as well. And
Yeah.
remember that Badshah Khan has a daughter, and she's very well educated. So he educates his daughter very well, just as he educated his own sons. Okay, right?
Yes.
That's number two is schooling. Number three is certainly, if you had to think about
Hmm.
the social reforms, I think the upliftment of women, it was for him a crucial issue, as it certainly was for Gandhi. And I think that this is, I would say, one of the fundamental contributions of Bacha Khan to the traditions of social reform that we're talking about. Fourthly, um, his promotion of the language, the Pashtun language. People don't
Yes.
people don't talk
Yes.
about that very much. But in fact, he
Yes.
founded the Pakhtun magazine, which became the mouthpiece of the KK, of the Khuday Khidmatkars. And this magazine had
Yes.
prose and poetry. And in fact, Badshah Khan's eldest son, Abdul Ghani Khan, himself contributed voluminously and is a major shaper of uh, the language. Okay, so I think that
Wow.
if you had to think about the traditions of social reform, I think we will certainly have to think about uh, his role in the promotion of the language. And why is that important? It's also important because if you're going to think about the possibility of a Pakhtun nation, then then you have to think about what language will that nation have? And is that language
Yes.
adequate to express the aspirations of the nation? The languages continue to grow. So the only way they grow is when you continue to promote them as well. You see, right? So I've
Yes.
given you four areas where he worked, four areas of social
Yeah. This.
that he worked, and all of them, okay, have some relationship also to his work in the larger area of nonviolence.
Yeah, I think these are very significant point. One of the thing that I personally feel when I read Bacha Khan is like he was far more concerned with and far more focused on this idea of empowerment. As you said, that he was trying to empower women, he was trying to empower the lower classes. I think this idea is different from the empty slogans that we use in the name of rights. So I
Yes.
feel this idea of empowerment is like far more significant and far more something that distinguishes Bacha Khan. Now we talked about his role in social reforms. What role did he play in the independence movement? And I am asking this question because I personally feel that when even in India, when people are talking about independence movement, they are not enough talking about Bacha Khan. So like S. Irfan Habib has authored a whole book on Indian nationalism. I have talked with him. I loved that book, but there is a very small portion in that book
Yes.
that talks about the idea of Bacha Khan. So I
Yeah, yeah.
like uh, like what is his role, and
Well,
do you feel like it's enough, like it is
Asir,
remembered enough?
a tremendous role. I mean, Asir Khan Habib, of course, will not talk about Badshah Khan because he talks mainly about the role of the so-called revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh and the Hindustan Republican Socialist Army. He's much more enamored by by those people. I won't get into that. I won't get into a critique of his work. But I'll say this, that I think uh, Bacha Khan. So, I start earlier on in this conversation, I mentioned that Gandhi said that if there is a perfect exponent of Satyagraha that he has ever known, it has to be Badshah Khan. Okay, so we have to begin with that. We have to begin with the fact that what he's able to do is he's able to bring the idea of nonviolent resistance to an area which uh, did not seem hospitable to the idea of nonviolent resistance at all. Okay, everything in the tradition of the frontier went against that. Everything in the tradition of the colonial administration in the frontier went against it. And in fact, when Badshah Khan came on the scene and becomes prominent and founds the Khudai Khidmatkars, the colonial administration was totally taken by surprise. They knew how to deal with a Pashtun who had a rifle in his hand. They did not know how to deal with a Pashtun who did not have a rifle in his hand.
Yes.
Okay, that was so the Khudai
Yes.
kidnappers became the most formidable opponent of the colonial administration, and that is one reason that the colonial administration dealt with them with a very firm hand whenever they could, breaking them up, dispersing them, imprisoning their the KK members in jails for long periods of time. We know that Badshah Khan himself spent 27 and a half some years in prison, little more than half of that after
Yes.
1947, after the creation of Pakistan. So even after independence, he continued to be imprisoned, for many years. But of course, he first tasted, uh, uh, the prison cell, if I may use that English. He had his first taste of a prison cell during the colonial period. Now, so what's their
Yeah.
contribution? So the first is the creation of the Khudai Khidmatkars. And if you know what happened in Peshawar in the early 1930s,
Yes.
in the aftermath of the
Yes.
Salt March, when you had a whole incident which led to police firing and over 200 people were killed. And what was amazing was that if you read the record, it's exactly like Sarojini Naidu's raid on the Darshana salt works, which
Mm-hmm.
became known around the world because it was an independent reporter by the name of Webb Miller who saw what had happened. Let me describe what had happened there because exactly the same thing happened, okay, in Peshawar, except with much more fatal consequences in Peshawar. So what happened, okay, in Gujarat after Gandhi arrives in Dandi, and that gives a signal to everyone that
Mm-hmm.
you can now break the salt law. So Sarojini Naidu led
Mm-hmm.
the Congress workers in a raid on the Darshana salt works. All right. And in this
Mm-hmm.
raid, so you have the police and horseback and infantry, and the policemen in colonial India, they used to carry a baton, huge baton, uh, iron tipped, and
Yeah.
they would crack your skull with it. So Webb Miller saw that a row of these, so let's say there's a row of Congress volunteers, and then behind that there's another row, and then behind that
Yeah.
another row, and yet another, and so on. So the first row of people would walk up. They had been warned that if you approach any closer, we are going to hit you, and
Yeah.
they were hit on the head. And he could hear the whacking of the baton and see the blood come out. And then people with stretchers would run and they would put these volunteers who had now been beaten senseless, in some cases beaten dead, okay, on these stretchers. And then the next row of volunteers, knowing exactly what's going to happen, would come. And then the same thing would happen to them. And Webb Miller sent
Mm-hmm.
this dispatch and he said, it seems like independence has arrived because the British have lost this
Legitimacy.
particular battle. They have lost the battle for human dignity.
Yeah.
Okay? Now in Peshawar, exactly the same thing happened with much more fatal consequences. Why? Because the KKK, they would go up, there are these soldiers with rifles, and they're told you can't approach any closer, and they do, and they're shot on the spot. And then the next layer goes, and they're shot, and then the next layer. There are lots of descriptions of that. Lots of descriptions of that. Okay. Now, see, you might say, okay, it's senseless sacrifice. Well, that's not how resistance works, okay? Because what that signaled to the British was the resolute determination of the Khudai Khidmatkars to remain, let's go back to that phrase I used, part of a disciplined army of non-violent resistors. They are changing the very meaning and significance of what an army is. Because if we're going to be successful in carrying out non-violent resistance, we're probably going to have to create non-violent armies. You see, people singly here and there, my moral conscience might tell me I have to resist, but my moral conscience is not enough unless I bring an army behind me, okay, which acts in much the same way in which I am acting. Okay. Individual conscience
Oh,
can only go so far. If you're trying to organize mass resistance, you'll have to do something different. So that's one
yeah.
part of the answer to your question. How did they contribute to the freedom struggle? The other way Bacha contributes is he becomes part of the inner circle of the Congress. Inner circle of the
Mm-hmm.
Congress. Bacha Khan was, as very closely allied to the Congress because he counted Gandhi and Nehru and Maulana Azad and others among his friends. And so he would go to the AICC. AICC is the All India Congress Committee meetings. He's an
Mm-hmm.
important part of the deliberations in many ways in the 1930s and 1940s about Congress policy towards the British government. Right? So we also have to think about his place in the Congress, his place in the highest decision-making bodies. In some ways, we'll see that in 1947, uh, things took a very different turn. But certainly,
Yeah.
uh, he was a member of not simply a member of the Congress in that sense. He was closely allied to the leading members of the Congress. And of course, he hosted Congress leaders who came to the frontier, including Gandhi. If I had time, I
Yes.
would have shown
Yeah.
you some very rare photographs, extremely
Wow.
rare. They've almost never been seen of Gandhi and Badshah Khan together because
Mm.
Gandhi came to the frontier more than once, and he and
Yeah.
he and there are photographs of the two of them. And of course, at that time, it was the idea of undivided India. We're still speaking about 30s, early 40s, and Gandhi considered the frontier to be as much a place um, for political action um, as the rest of India. It was in that sense it was
Mm-hmm.
no different from the rest of India. It was part of the political landscape that Gandhi had made his own, right? So I think if we're looking at the contribution in political terms, it would be that. But let's not forget that the fight for freedom is a fight for economic freedom, social freedom, cultural freedom as well, not just
Yes.
political freedom. In fact, political freedom was the easiest to gain.
Mm-hmm.
The other freedoms are much more difficult to gain. Now, in that sense, Badshah Khan's contribution and the contribution of the KKK is also extremely significant. You see, so it's not only the creation of the KKK, nonviolent disciplined resistance, political resistance, work with work with the Congress Party. It's the very work that he did, that Badshah Khan did in the frontier, okay, and the work that he did as a representative of Islam. All of that is part of the
Wow.
story of his contribution to the independence struggle, because independence, it is automatically assumed that it means political self-determination. No, that's not sufficient. Gandhi was very clear, and Ambedkar was very
Yes.
clear that there can be no such thing as political independence
Yes,
without
Ambedkar was
economic,
clear.
social, cultural independence, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so like these points were again very significant, and I cannot emphasize the significance of these points enough. When I was, you just mentioned Ambedkar. When I was reading Ambedkar's Annihilation of the Caste, he was criticizing, I think, Congress on this point. That I think we cannot go into that in detail, but he was criticizing Congress on the point that they are like now focused on political freedom, but they are ignoring the social question. And now, when I was reading a book, it's in Pashto, پښتني ښځې او د قام خدمت پښتون women and national services, they were again and again emphasizing this point that political freedom is insignificant unless you do not reform this society as well.
Yes. Yes.
And again, like this is an aspect in Bacha Khan that I would love to revive and speak about again and again, because this is really important. And you mentioned about his role in Congress. I mentioned this point to you because, let's say, for example, if I watch a movie on independent struggle of certain political leaders, I don't see Bacha Khan enough featured in
Yes.
those movies. For
Yeah.
example, I don't see him enough featured in books. I was reading a book of Shashi Tharoor, and I think there was only one paragraph that talked about Bacha Khan. It's Indian nationalism book, I think. So that is why I had asked this question.
You're
And
you're absolutely right, but that's not my view, right? I think you know fully well
yeah,
that I have
yeah,
I consider Badshah Khan to be uh, a figure, not simply a gigantic figure on the Indian political landscape, but I consider him to be a gigantic figure on the uh, on the international landscape. Uh, when we're thinking of politics, ethics,
yeah,
I think he's unquestionably one of the most significant people of the 20th century, and I think that his role in the independence struggle has been um, not sufficiently understood and appreciated. I think
yeah,
there are massive shortcomings there. But somebody like Shashi Tharoor is well aware, and I think that there are other contexts in which he might perhaps take a slightly, more generous, more capacious view. If because I think that, for example, uh, we know that somebody like Ram Gua, for example, I think he would have a much deeper appreciation of what Bacha Khan stood for. But here again, I think the problem
mhm,
is, to go back to an earlier question you had asked, there is still a lingering tendency, especially in India, to think
yeah,
of him really only as kind of an appendage to Gandhi, as the frontier Gandhi, not in the way in which I was suggesting that we can use that
yes,
phrase to dramatic effect and then think
yeah,
about what it means, but more there simply as a way of saying that, well, you know, he's really second to Gandhi. So there's Gandhi and then there's the frontier Gandhi,
yeah,
you know. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that we have to abandon that idea of a hierarchy, because I think Bacha Khan is critically important. But again, at the same time, it has to be said that Bacha Khan, for example, even his autobiography has been available in English.
yeah,
There was a much shorter version available 4 decades ago, My Life and Struggle, Hind pocketbook edition,
yes,
which I've had for the last 45 years. Okay. But the full autobiography in English only became available very recently. And Gandhi, on the other hand, his writings were voluminous. So Gandhi became an
yeah,
international figure in his lifetime in a way that Bacha Khan never could. Gandhi carried on a
yeah,
correspondence with thousands of people, thousands.
yeah,
The Gandhi archive is 1,000 times greater than the Badshah Khan archive, because the
yes,
amount of
yes,
material is just astronomical. You see?
Yeah.
And, so I was talking about the magazine that he founded, Bacha Khan, Pakto, and which became the mouthpiece of the KK, right? But how many people read that language?
Yeah.
Gandhi founded and edited four newspapers, four
Yeah.
in his lifetime, and they're all published in English as well. They're also Hindi edition, Gujarati edition in some cases.
Wow.
Indian
Yeah.
Opinion was published in multiple languages, multiple languages.
Yeah.
Okay, and he wrote over 1,000 pieces for these
Yes.
journals. So there are reasons why it's not only because God, that the hierarchy has been created, and that we should question that hierarchy. But the situation is in that way somewhat more complex, because, and of course, Gandhi is older than Badshah Khan. He is the author of the idea of satyagraha, right? So
Yeah.
there are obviously reasons why, no matter what one says, people will be inclined to think of Bacha Khan only as the frontier Gandhi and as nothing else. But as I said, the recent scholarship, we had a student at UCLA who completed a PhD dissertation on the Khudai Khidmatkars and Bacha Khan, a very rich dissertation. Safura Arbab is her name, and she wrote a whole
Yes.
dissertation,
Yeah.
where she suggests that we have to think of Bacha Khan as charting out an independent trajectory. She suggests that his ideas of village reconstruction, his work with the villagers went much deeper than Gandhi's did. I'm not, I was, I know the dissertation, I was part of her dissertation committee. I'm not sure that I would be entirely in agreement with all the observations, but it's an important work. But there are others who have also written in that vein in recent years. And I think we should
Yeah.
pay more attention to that work.
Well, I am still like happy that India has at least kept it alive, kept him alive. In Pakistan, we don't speak enough about him. We call him traitor. So, and that is my last question. I would like to come to this question of betrayal. We could relate it to as he is understood in Pakistan as well. But in like as 1947 is approaching, and after 1947, there is a feeling in Bacha Khan that I am betrayed, and I am betrayed by
Yes.
Congress.
Yeah.
Like they would say like we sacrificed too much for the independence struggle, as you mentioned, 1930s and everything, and then we got betrayed. They had thrown us to the wolves. I think that that was used. So what?
Yes.
How do you make sense of this fact?
Okay. So let me say this. I mean, what you're saying, yes, Bacha Khan himself actually mentions that. So, this is that book I was talking about, the autobiography, right? So it's
Yeah.
towards the very end, um, he has he has a discussion of that. So, uh, Khan Abdul Ghaffar repeated this a number of times, that if the Congress were to throw the Khudai Khidmatkar to the wolves, this would be tantamount to the betrayal of the frontier province. This is page 496, for instance, of this book. That
Yeah.
expression, thrown to the wolves, has been used repeatedly since that time. Let me begin by saying this, and then I'll be more specific. That I think it is probably not very productive to go back to those times and to try to step into the shoes of everyone who was involved in the negotiations. There's been
Yeah.
long been a discussion in India. I think it's a fruitless
Yeah.
discussion today. Uh,
Yeah.
who's the who's responsible for the partition? That's the question. Okay, who Ram Manohar Lohia, who was an Indian uh, politician and thinker, and someone who actually felt very close to Gandhi, but he came out of the socialist tradition. So he came out of the Congress Socialist Party tradition. He even wrote a book called "Who Are the Guilty Men of India's Partition?" Okay, that was the title of his
Hmm.
book. Okay, and this question never dies down. Uh, and people
Yeah.
are prepared to have an endless discussion on this, which
Yeah.
usually goes nowhere at all, if you ask me, because I think the
Yeah.
ideas are set. There are those who think Gandhi is responsible. There are those who think Nehru is responsible. There are those who think Patel is responsible. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are those who think that the whole trouble began with Jinnah. And then there are those who point out that the two nation theory that Iqbal had already moved in the direction of the two nation theory. There are others who point out that actually there were Hindu nationalists such as Savarkar, okay,
Yeah.
extreme Hindu nationalists who were already advocating the two nation theory long before any of these people. Uh, so if you go back to the mid 1920s, mid late 1920s, when Savarkar begins to do his ideological work, and he is one of the fathers of Hindutva. Okay,
Yeah.
he says very clearly the Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations, right? That seems to be the argument. So who's responsible? And that's what I meant, that this discussion will go on endlessly, right? I don't think
Yeah.
it's very productive. However, if I had to answer your question as best as I can without getting into abstractions of how one thinks about power,
Hmm.
because I think one has to think about the nature of power. One has to think about what happens to the aspirations of people, what happens when you've been fighting for independence for 40 years, and then it seems to be, there on the horizon, and then it seems to go away. Um, and and the lust for power. All these are important considerations. To think about what happened. So what happened? Let's be very clear about that very clearly. That Bacha Khan uh, was an advocate for the idea of a united homeland of a kind for
Yes.
the Pashtuns. But he's not arguing for a separate country necessarily. There's a difference. He's
Yes.
arguing more for something like a federated structure in which Pashtunistan or Pakhtunistan, a land for the Pakhtuns or Pashtuns or the Pathans, whichever term one wants to use, right? Because I think all three terms are used, a land for them which would be autonomous within the federation. Okay. Uh, so 1947, Mountbatten announces the partition plan, the partition of Bengal and Punjab, and the creation of a new nation state, where Pakistan, where uh, 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 Muslims would have their own nation state, and Bengal and Punjab would be partitioned at either end of the country. So Badshah Khan, of course, is surprised. He's agitated to some degree. What about the Pathans? Because to understand his dilemma, all we need to know is that the Pashtuns were never with the Muslim League. Never. That
Yes.
much is very
Yeah.
clear. They were never with the Muslim League.
Yeah.
Okay, and the Muslim League, in fact, actually had a position of hostility towards the Khudai Khidmatkars. Uh, I can also
Yeah.
this. I will add a little footnote here that in a way, the Badshah Khan. It's very ironic. Badshah Khan is basically sometimes cast as a person who was himself a traitor because he was too close to the Hindus, just as
Yes.
Gandhi was cast
Yeah.
as a traitor because he was too close to the Muslims.
Muslims. Yes.
Okay,
Definitely.
you know,
It's a very good point. It's a very
yeah.
good point that you mentioned.
No,
Yeah.
it's very interesting that
Yeah.
both of them are cast as being too close to the other. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of suspicion towards Badshah Khan, and so Badshah Khan said, "Well, let there be there'll be that there, that it was proposed that there would be in this plan of partition there would be a referendum uh,
Yeah.
for the frontier because they knew that the Pashtuns are not going to be happy to be with the Muslim League in Pakistan. So the proposal was that there should be a referendum, um, and Bacha Khan's position was to say that we're going to boycott this referendum. Okay, we're going to boycott this referendum, and the reason they're going to boycott this referendum is because, of course, everything has already been decided. We should have been
Mhm.
consulted before this partition plan was created.
Yeah.
Okay, right? So, in fact, the Khudai Khidmatkars boycotted the referendum. This is the Northwest Frontier Province referendum of July 1947. Before that, by the way, there had been a resolution. It is called the Bano Resolution. This was a resolution of June 21st,
Mhm.
which had called for an independent state of Pakhtunistan.
Yeah.
Mountbatten refused to concede this resolution. Okay, so and
Mhm.
of course Mountbatten was the viceroy. It is after this resolution. So before there is the Northwest Frontier Province referendum, there is this resolution. This resolution, as I said, called for an independent state for the Pakhtuns. It was rejected by Mountbatten. Thereupon, then, in place of that, there was going to be a referendum. This referendum was held on July 6th of 1947. The KKK boycotted it, but the referendum passed with a 99% support. That is,
For
and
Pakistan.
support for what? That the frontier would become part of Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Okay,
Pakistan.
would become part of Pakistan. This is what Bacha Khan calls the betrayal. And he says in his autobiography that he was surprised that even Gandhi and Nehru, whom he considered to be his closest friends and supporters, that they did not support the Pakhtuns on this. And the question is, is his understanding correct? How do we view it? And what would be the reasons, if indeed that's the case, why Nehru and Gandhi did not support the idea of a separate, okay, state for Pakhtunis, for the Pakhtuns, that is
Mhm.
Pakhtunistan.
Mhm.
So here, let me just quote one or two lines from here, and then I'll tell you my own interpretation. So this is from this book here. So he says, bottom of page 498, Bacha Khan says, I have no complaint against Sardar Patel and Raja Gopalachari. Not all your listeners will know who Raja Gopalachari. I think Sardar Patel, most people will know because Sardar Patel
Yeah.
was, along with Gandhi and Nehru, the third most important figure, at least among the Hindus. And then Maulana Azad is, of course, a critically important person as well. And Patel became the Home Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister of India in Nehru's first cabinet. He only lived for 2, 3 years. He was very close to Gandhi, and in fact, he was the one who organized some of the Satyagraha campaigns in Gujarat. Um, uh,
Mhm.
okay, and Patel also had a reputation for being pro-Hindu. This is a subject I won't get into right now because there,
Yeah.
there's there's lots of conflicting views on how to assess Patel. But he says, I have no complaint against Sardar Patel and Raja Gopalachari. They were part of the Congress Working Committee. So the Congress Working
Yeah.
Committee was the highest executive uh, uh, body within the Congress. Okay,
Yeah.
comprised of roughly 15, 20 people, and they are the ones who took who were authorized to take the final decisions on the most vital points. Okay. Uh, I have a complaint, says uh, Badshah Khan. After saying I have no complaints against Sardar Patel and Rajagopalachari, I have a complaint against Jawaharlal, that is Nehru and
Yeah.
Gandhiji, that they too agreed with them in this matter. The Congress leaders said that the conditions were such that there was no other way other than partition. But who created these conditions? They themselves are responsible for them. If they had not partitioned Hindustan, then Hindustan and the Hindus would not have experienced such bloodshed. Okay? Uh, but then he says, and this is the last paragraph of his book. We have been liberated
Yeah.
and the British were about to leave our land, but on the instigation of Lord Mountbatten and Sardar Patel, we became the slave of slaves. Last paragraph. Okay. Now
Mountbatten and
here,
Patel.
now here he's saying, I do blame Sardar Patel and I do blame Mountbatten. He's not mentioning Jawaharlal
Yeah.
and Gandhi here.
Yeah.
Notice, right? See,
Yeah.
Bacha Khan himself in this matter is not simply conflicted. He did not have an assessment which understood that there are structures and powers which are far greater than individuals.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, the idea of partition in that sense was irreversible. It couldn't be stopped at
Okay.
that juncture. It couldn't
Yeah.
be stopped because it's not the case that the Indians had the autonomy to decide for themselves. The British are still there. The British
Yeah.
constantly said, we're leaving it to the Indians to resolve the matter amongst themselves. But it's the British who created the problem in the first place.
Yeah. Yes. 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 Yes.
It's
This,
the
it's a
British
very
who
good point.
created the very problem in the first place. And throughout his autobiography, Badshah Khan understands that. He says, who created the Muslim League? The Muslim League just didn't
Mhm.
arise out of Muslims saying, we don't feel happy in India. In fact, Muslims were part of the Congress party initially. Okay. Even Jinnah
Yes.
was a member of the Congress party. It was the British who created the Muslim League and who communalized the whole political landscape to begin with. The problem is that communalism has become so entrenched by this point in
Yes.
time that I don't think it was within the power of anyone really to stop this thing. This was an idea. It was a very bad idea, but it was an idea that had now acquired a life of its own. Okay. And remember also that one of the things that Badshah Khan does not talk about, he doesn't talk about the Sikhs. The Sikhs also
Yes.
wanted their own homeland. But they were
Yeah.
represented by Tara Singh in the
Yeah.
deliberation that took place. That idea was also rejected because
Yes.
because what Gandhi and Nehru understood was that this can lead to, let me use that very common phrase, it can lead to the balkanization.
Balkanization of India. Yeah.
It can
Definitely.
lead to the
Yeah.
balkanization of India. And of course, don't forget that you also the Pashtuns were divided between two nation states, one of which has no part in the discussions at all. That's Afghanistan. When the Durand line was drawn, what did it do?
Yes,
It
of
divided the
course. And yeah.
Pashtuns. And the Durand line is also a creation of the British. How
Yeah.
did the creation of a Pakhtunistan, where you
Yes.
Pashtuns only in Pakistan as a part of it, because you've got Pashtuns in Afghanistan as well, right? All of this could
Yeah.
not have
Yeah.
resolved,
Definitely.
okay, if you ask me. It could not have been. So in that sense, I think Badshah Khan, I think, was speaking more from his gut feeling that he just felt that, look, we as a people, because the Congress had said we're going to stand by you, and the Muslims started taunting, the Muslim League started taunting Badshah Khan, saying the Congress used you when they
Yeah.
wanted to.
Yeah.
Now that you need them, they're abandoning you. But it was precisely that, it was a taunt by a bully. And what do you do with a taunt by a bully?
Yeah.
Ignore it. Badshah Khan, unfortunately, for the
Yeah.
first time, did not ignore it. He took it too much to heart and began to think that the
Yeah.
Congress is really against us. I don't think that was the case. I think that it was an admission by the
Yeah.
Congress that we do not have the power to actually be able to resolve this matter and to be able to give a homeland to your people. I think
Yeah.
it was an admission that they simply didn't have the power to be able to do that. And I think that is what happened in 1947. So my own view of the matter is that talks of betrayal and all of that are fine because that's the language that was used, but they're not fine if one is trying to understand the politics of those times and trying to understand the situation in 1947, where, as I said, even the demand for by the Sikhs for their own homeland in the Punjab was not accepted. And we know that had consequences for India later on when you continue to have a Sikh secessionist movement. And we know what happened in the
Yeah,
1980s. We know
yeah,
that there's still Sikh secessionists, Khalistanis as they're called, including in the state of California where I live. There's a huge number of them over here. But I think ultimately, what one should be thinking about is something very different. And again, now it's an afterthought, and that is that why wasn't it that people work towards a federation? That idea was
yeah,
given some thought at that point, but not enough. And I think
yeah.
that when we look into the future and we think about this whole area, when we think about India, Pakistan, the frontier, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and we think about even Afghanistan, what we have to think about, maybe it's decades ahead, if at all, we have to think about a federation of South Asian states.
It's it's a very beautiful idea, and I agree with your point, and I am very happy that you said that because it also now gives me the opportunity to argue the same point on the basis of some authority. I think we also in Pakistan, when we are talking about 1947, when we are talking about the whole 20th century, we are quite often ignoring the fact that these people were acting in a situation which was colonialism. And like you cannot just blame a single person that why he thought that, why he didn't do that, and this this aspect of the presence of the British is, I think, ignored even in Pakistan. And as you quite rightly pointed out, that when we are assessing this 1947, we are again ignoring the specter, and even Bacha Khan ignored this point. So uh, I think I took a lot of your time, even more than we had planned. But if you could briefly, and this is the last question, if you could briefly comment on this idea, let's say if Bacha Khan had read Machiavelli, would he have been a bit more successful?
If he had read Machiavelli, would he have been? No, no, because
And he had internalized Machiavelli
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
it
yeah,
also
yeah.
requires internalization.
Yeah, but before, by the way, before there was Machiavelli, long before there was Machiavelli, there was Kautilya, the author of the
Yeah,
Arthashastra. You see, and again,
yeah,
it is,
Arthashastra,
and pardon me for saying so, but again, it is a sign of the times that we know about Machiavelli. Even in that part of the world,
yeah,
we don't know about Kautilya because what is it? The both of them are
yeah,
are basically, and Kautilya or Chanakya, by the other name by which he's known, he's writing at least 1,500 years before Machiavelli is. And what are the both of them
yeah,
writing about? They're writing about the science of statecraft. Okay. Now, I think your question is an interesting one in this way that,
yeah,
Bacha Khan is not a politician in that sense, if you see what I mean. He's in politics, but he's not a politician in the way in which Gandhi is not really a politician. There's a difference between being in politics
yeah. That is the
and
point that I wanted
being
to say.
and being a politician. You
Yeah,
see, being a Churchill is a politician. That's his profession. That's his profession.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
For these people, this is for Gandhi, for Badshah Khan, this is not their profession. They're in politics because the fundamental ethical questions for them have to be worked out in the domain of politics as well. And you cannot
yes,
you cannot
yeah,
run away from that field of politics for them. Ideally,
yeah,
somebody like Gandhi, Badshah Khan, you can think of them as saintly figures, which they are in a certain way. You see, but they are not saintly figures who are going to stay holed
yeah,
up in a cave. Okay, they're saying that that whatever
Yes.
ethics, whatever the key questions are, they have to be tested out by wading into politics, because politics is like the slum. You wade into it, there's dirt there, there's
Yeah.
filth there, there's contamination there, and if you can emerge intact, okay, it tests you in a way that nothing else can, you see. All right. So uh, your
Yeah.
question is an interesting one, because I think that the science of statecraft, as it were, okay, the cunningness and all of that, that was not the world that Gandhi and Bacha Khan inhabited at all, you see. So I don't think that somebody like Machiavelli would
Mm-hmm.
even have left any impression on Bacha Khan, except for Bacha Khan to say that, that's the world of the devil, so to speak. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
you see what I
definitely.
mean.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, thank you so much, sir, for your time. I think we covered some territory to 1947, but and I took even more time, as I said, than we had planned. So, thank you so much for your time, for your
Sure.
ideas, for your analysis.
It's
It means a
it's
lot.
been
Thank you
it's
so much,
been
sir.
wonderful talking to you, and been a pleasure, and I wish you every success in all your endeavors.
Yes, thank you so much, sir.
Uh,
So, should I stop this recording?
yeah, we
Yes,
can
sir.
stop the recording, and then we can just have a